I only needed one woman tonight. Just one stranger willing to pretend she loved me while the woman who broke my heart celebrated her engagement across the ballroom. The rain had been falling over Manhattan since late afternoon, turning the streets of New York City into long rivers of reflected light. Yellow taxi cabs crawled through traffic, horns echoing between the tall glass buildings that stretched toward the gray sky. Adrian Cole sat silently in the back seat of his black car as it moved slowly along Fifth Avenue. At 35 years old, he was one of the most successful venture capital investors in the United States of America. Financial magazines called him brilliant. Business reporters called him ruthless. But tonight he felt something far simpler. Tonight he felt like a man who had lost. In less than 2 hours, the woman he once planned to marry would stand inside the Grand Lexington Hotel and celebrate her engagement to another man. Natalie Cross. The name still echoed in his mind like a bruise that refused to heal. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, printed on thick ivory paper, elegant and deliberate. Adrian had stared at it for several minutes before realizing the message behind it. She wanted him to come. She wanted him to see that she had moved on to someone richer, someone older, someone whose family owned half the banking industry in North America. The man was Marcus Reed, heir to a financial empire worth several $1 billion. Adrian could have ignored the invitation. Most people expected him to. But something inside him refused to disappear quietly. Something stubborn and wounded insisted on showing up. The car stopped at a red light near Central Park. Adrian looked out the window. That was when he saw her. Under the dim glow of a street lamp, standing near the entrance of a subway station, a young woman was playing a violin. The instrument was old but carefully maintained. Her coat was thin and the rain had dampened strands of dark hair that fell around her face. A small open case sat on the sidewalk in front of her with a few dollar bills inside. Yet the music she played was breathtaking. The melody rose above the sound of traffic and rain with a kind of quiet courage. Adrian felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. The driver glanced into the rearview mirror. "Sir, the light is about to change." Adrian did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on the young violinist. There was something about the way she played that felt honest in a city where honesty was rare. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Adrian opened the car door and stepped out into the rain. Water soaked instantly into the shoulders of his tailored coat, but he did not seem to notice. The young woman finished her piece and lowered the violin slowly. She looked surprised when a tall stranger in an expensive suit walked toward her through the rain. Adrian reached into his pocket and pulled out several crisp $100 bills. He placed them gently into her violin case. Her eyes widened with confusion. "You do not have to do that," she said softly. Adrian studied her for a moment. Up close he could see exhaustion in her eyes, but also intelligence and quiet determination. "What is your name?" he asked. "Sophie," she answered. "Sophie Bennett." Adrian nodded slowly as an unexpected idea formed in his mind, reckless and strange, but impossible to ignore. "Sophie," he said calmly, "I need your help tonight." The rain continued to fall around them as the city lights flickered across the wet pavement. Sophie tilted her head slightly, uncertain whether she should laugh or walk away. Adrian met her gaze with complete seriousness. "I need someone to come with me to a very important party and pretend to be my girlfriend. Only for one night." Sophie's fingers tightened around the neck of her violin. She searched his face for any sign that this was a joke. Instead, she found something else. Pain, determination, and a story she did not yet understand. The traffic light turned green behind them, and the long line of waiting cars began to move again, but neither of them noticed. Because in that quiet moment beneath the rain-soaked street lamp, the decision that would change both of their lives had just begun. The rain continued to fall softly around the street lamp as Sophie Bennett stood frozen with her violin still resting in her hands. For several seconds, she said nothing. In New York City, strange things happened every day, but a wealthy stranger asking a street musician to pretend to be his girlfriend at a formal party was still far beyond ordinary. Sophie studied Adrian Cole carefully. His suit alone probably cost more than everything she owned. His shoes were polished black leather, and his watch reflected the pale streetlight with quiet elegance. Yet his expression carried something unexpected. He looked tired. Not physically tired, but the kind of tired that came from disappointment that had not yet healed. Finally, Sophie spoke. You are serious about this? Adrian nodded slowly. Completely serious. I know it sounds strange, but I promise you this is a respectful arrangement. One evening, you attend a party with me and act like my date. That is all. Sophie glanced down at the open violin case where the crisp $100 bills still rested among a few wrinkled singles. She hesitated. I do not even know you. Adrian extended his hand politely. Adrian Cole. Sophie blinked in recognition. The name sounded familiar. She had seen it once on the business channel playing in a diner where she sometimes worked morning shifts. You are the investment guy. Adrian gave a faint smile. Something like that. Sophie let out a quiet breath and looked toward the busy avenue where cars splashed through puddles and pedestrians hurried past with umbrellas. The world was still moving quickly around them, but somehow this strange moment felt isolated from everything else. Why me? She asked finally. There are probably thousands of women in this city who would say yes without hesitation. Adrian looked at the violin in her hands before answering. Because you did not ask for anything. You were simply playing music in the rain. That kind of honesty is rare tonight. Sophie tilted her head slightly. Tonight. Adrian nodded and glanced at the time on his watch. In less than 90 minutes I have to walk into the Grand Lexington Hotel and attend the engagement celebration of my former girlfriend. The man she is marrying is Marcus Reed. His family controls Reed National Bank. Sophie raised her eyebrows slowly. That sounds uncomfortable. Adrian allowed a brief laugh that carried very little humor. That is one word for it. Sophie studied him again, this time with a little more sympathy. You want to prove something to her? Adrian shook his head. No, I want to prove something to myself. I refuse to walk into that ballroom alone. Like a man who lost everything. Sophie looked down at her coat, which was damp and slightly worn. She imagined the kind of glamorous party he was describing. Crystal chandeliers. Silk dresses. Wealthy guests who would immediately recognize that she did not belong. I do not have the right clothes for a place like that, she said quietly. Adrian gestured toward the black car waiting at the curb. That problem can be solved very quickly. Sophie followed his gaze. The driver stood patiently beside the car door as rain dripped from the brim of his cap. For a long moment Sophie remained silent, weighing the decision. Her life during the past year had been a constant struggle. Rent payments, part-time jobs, and late nights playing music for strangers who barely noticed her presence. The idea of stepping into another world for a single evening felt almost unreal. What exactly would I have to do? She asked cautiously. Adrian answered without hesitation. Smile. Walk beside me. Hold my hand if the situation requires it. Pretend that we met months ago and that we enjoy each other's company. Sophie crossed her arms slightly, thinking. And after tonight? After tonight we go back to our separate lives, Adrian said calmly. No expectations and no complications. Sophie looked down at the violin case once more, then back at Adrian. The rain began to soften into a light mist as the city lights reflected across the wet pavement like scattered gold. Finally, she closed the case and lifted it from the sidewalk. One night, she said slowly. Adrian nodded. One night. Sophie gave a small, uncertain smile. Then I suppose we should not keep your former girlfriend waiting. The black car pulled away from the curb and merged into the slow-moving traffic of Manhattan, while the rain faded into a thin mist that clung to the streets like a silver veil. Sophie Bennett sat quietly in the back seat beside Adrian Cole, her violin case resting across her lap. For the first few minutes neither of them spoke. The soft hum of the engine and the distant sound of horns echoing through the city filled the silence between them. Sophie glanced through the window as familiar blocks passed by. Small restaurants, convenience stores, and dim apartment buildings slowly gave way to brighter streets filled with luxury boutiques and tall glass towers. It felt as though the city itself was transforming with every mile they traveled north. Finally, Sophie turned toward Adrian. I still cannot believe I said yes to this. Adrian leaned back slightly, studying her expression. You can still change your mind. The driver can take you anywhere you want. Sophie shook her head slowly. No, I made a promise. One night, remember. Adrian nodded with quiet respect. One night. The car soon stopped in front of a tall building on Madison Avenue, where warm golden light spilled from large windows onto the wet sidewalk. A sign above the entrance read Bennett and Ashford Couture. Sophie stared at the elegant storefront in disbelief. Adrian opened the car door and stepped out before offering his hand to help her. Sophie hesitated for a moment before accepting it. The moment she stepped inside, she felt as though she had walked into another world. The room smelled faintly of perfume and polished wood. Long mirrors reflected soft light across rows of beautiful evening gowns displayed like works of art. A woman in her early 40s approached them with a confident smile. "Adrian, you are late again," she said playfully. Adrian offered a polite nod. "Good evening, Margaret. Thank you for staying open." Margaret Ashford turned her attention towards Sophie with curious interest. And this must be the mysterious guest. Sophie felt suddenly self-conscious under the elegant lighting. "I am Sophie Bennett." Margaret studied her for only a second before smiling warmly. "Do not worry, Sophie. By the time we are finished tonight, you will look like you belong in the most exclusive ballroom in New York City." Sophie blinked in surprise. "That might take a miracle." Margaret laughed softly. "Miracles are simply well-prepared opportunities." Within minutes, Sophie found herself guided toward a private dressing room where assistants gently measured her shoulders and waist. Elegant gowns in deep shades of blue, silver, and black were brought forward one after another. Sophie had never worn anything like them before. Each fabric shimmered under the lights like flowing water. Adrian waited quietly in the main lounge while the transformation unfolded behind the closed door. He stood near the window watching the city outside while memories of the past returned to him without invitation. Natalie crossed laughing at a charity gala. Natalie promising that she believed in him before his first company ever succeeded. Then Natalie leaving. The moment another man offered a life filled with even greater wealth and power. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, pushing the thoughts away. Tonight was not about the past. Tonight was about walking forward without regret. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the dressing room door opened again. Margaret stepped out first with a proud expression. "Adrian, you may look now." Adrian turned slowly. Sophie stepped into the room wearing a deep midnight blue gown that flowed gracefully to the floor. The fabric shimmered softly each time she moved. Her hair had been carefully arranged so that it framed her face with quiet elegance. For a moment Adrian said nothing at all. Sophie shifted nervously. "Is it too much?" Adrian shook his head slowly. "No, it is exactly right." Margaret placed a small velvet box into Adrian's hand. Inside rested a delicate silver necklace with a single sapphire stone. Adrian stepped closer to Sophie and spoke gently. "May I?" Sophie nodded quietly. Adrian fastened the necklace around her neck, and the sapphire caught the light like a tiny star. Sophie looked at her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman standing there. Margaret smiled with satisfaction. "Now you are ready for the Grand Lexington Hotel." Sophie turned toward Adrian with a mixture of excitement and nervous curiosity. "I hope you know what you are doing," she said softly. Adrian offered a calm, reassuring smile. "I have absolutely no idea. But together we are about to find out." The black car moved smoothly through the glowing streets of Manhattan as night settled fully over the city. Sophie Bennett sat quietly beside Adrian Cole, still adjusting to the unfamiliar weight of the elegant midnight blue gown. The sapphire necklace rested lightly against her collarbone, catching reflections from the passing streetlights outside the window. Every few seconds Sophie glanced at her own reflection in the dark glass of the car door, as if she expected the illusion to disappear at any moment. Adrian noticed the way her fingers lightly touched the fabric of the dress, almost as if she were making sure it was real. "You look like you belong at this party," he said calmly. Sophie gave a small, uncertain laugh. "That is exactly what I am worried about." Adrian turned slightly toward her. "Why is that?" Sophie hesitated before answering. "Because I do not belong in places like this. I play music on sidewalks, and sometimes in small restaurants when they allow it. People like the ones at your party probably do not even notice someone like me walking past them on the street." Adrian studied her face for a moment. "That might be true for most of them," he said quietly. "But tonight they will notice you." The car slowed as it approached a massive building glowing with warm golden light. The Grand Lexington Hotel rose above the avenue like a palace of marble and glass. A long red carpet stretched from the entrance down to the curb, where luxury cars arrived one after another. Uniformed attendants moved quickly beneath the bright lights, while photographers waited near the entrance hoping to capture images of wealthy guests arriving for the celebration. Sophie felt her stomach tighten slightly as the car came to a stop beside the carpet. "This place looks like something from a movie," she whispered. Adrian gave a faint smile. Sometimes it feels like one too. The driver opened the door, and the sound of distant music drifted through the night air. Adrian stepped out first, then turned and offered his hand to Sophie. For a moment she remained seated, looking out at the crowd of elegantly dressed people entering the building. Her reflection in the car window showed a version of herself she had never imagined becoming. Adrian spoke gently. "Remember our agreement. Just stay beside me." Sophie took a slow breath and placed her hand in his. The moment her shoes touched the red carpet, she felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes turning toward them. Cameras flashed from across the entrance as photographers tried to identify the mysterious woman arriving beside Adrian Cole. Sophie instinctively moved closer to Adrian, her hand resting lightly against his arm. Adrian leaned closer and spoke quietly, so only she could hear. "Perfect. That is exactly what a couple would do." Sophie whispered back without looking at him. "I am trying not to trip over this dress." Adrian chuckled softly as they walked toward the tall glass doors of the hotel. Inside the lobby, the sound of a live orchestra filled the air with smooth, elegant music. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, while guests in formal attire mingled beside tables covered with white linen and silver trays of champagne. Sophie's eyes widened as she took in the beauty of the ballroom beyond the lobby. It felt less like a party and more like a scene from another world. Adrian paused for a moment near the entrance of the main hall. "This is where things become interesting," he said quietly. Sophie followed his gaze across the crowded room. At the center of the ballroom stood a tall stage decorated with white roses and glowing lights. A large banner behind the stage displayed the names Natalie Cross and Marcus Reed in elegant gold letters. Sophie's heart beat faster as she realized that everyone in this room had come to celebrate the woman who had once broken the heart of the man standing beside her. Adrian straightened his jacket slightly before offering Sophie his arm again. "Ready?" he asked calmly. Sophie hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Ready." Together they stepped into the ballroom, unaware that within minutes the quiet street musician who had played violin beneath a rainy street lamp would become the most talked-about guest in the entire room. The ballroom of the Grand Lexington Hotel shimmered with soft golden light as Adrian Cole and Sophie Bennett stepped fully into the center of the celebration. Conversations continued around them, yet subtle changes rippled through the room as people began recognizing Adrian. Whispers passed quietly from table to table. Several guests glanced toward the elegant woman walking beside him, clearly surprised that he had arrived with someone unfamiliar. Sophie felt the weight of their attention almost immediately. She kept her posture calm and graceful the way Margaret Ashford had instructed her earlier, even though inside her heart was beating much faster than the music of the orchestra. Adrian leaned slightly toward her as they walked past a table of investors and socialites. "You are doing perfectly," he murmured. Sophie replied quietly without looking at him. "I feel like everyone here is trying to figure out who I am." Adrian gave a faint smile. "That means they are curious. Curiosity is better than judgment." A waiter approached with a silver tray filled with champagne glasses. Adrian lifted 2 glasses and handed one gently to Sophie. She accepted it carefully, hoping she would not accidentally spill anything on the beautiful dress. Across the room, several men from the business community approached Adrian with polite nods. "Adrian, good to see you here tonight," one of them said. "We did not expect you to attend." Adrian answered calmly. "I received the invitation. It seemed respectful to appear." The men nodded politely, but their attention quickly drifted toward Sophie. Adrian noticed the curiosity in their expressions and spoke clearly. "This is Sophie Bennett." Sophie offered a small, graceful smile. "It is nice to meet you." The men greeted her politely before continuing their quiet speculation once Adrian and Sophie walked away. Sophie whispered softly, "That was not so bad." Adrian looked across the ballroom toward the stage where the hosts of the evening had not yet appeared. "Give it a few minutes. The real moment has not happened yet." Sophie followed his gaze and finally noticed the elegant banner with the names Natalie Cross and Marcus Reed displayed in large gold letters above the stage. A soft wave of understanding passed through her. She realized that at some point tonight Adrian would have to face the woman whose decision had clearly changed his life. Before Sophie could speak again, the orchestra slowly lowered its volume and the lights near the stage grew brighter. A quiet announcement echoed through the ballroom as a master of ceremonies stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate the engagement of Natalie Cross and Marcus Reed. Applause spread across the room as the crowd turned toward the stage. Sophie felt Adrian straighten slightly beside her, though his expression remained calm. Moments later, Natalie Cross appeared at the top of the stage steps wearing a brilliant white gown that sparkled beneath the chandeliers. Her long blonde hair fell perfectly over her shoulders, and her confident smile suggested that she was completely comfortable being the center of attention. Beside her stood Marcus Reed, tall and composed in an expensive black suit, greeting guests with practiced elegance. Sophie studied Natalie carefully. The woman carried herself with the confidence of someone who had always belonged to this world of wealth and influence. Then Natalie's eyes moved across the crowd and suddenly paused. For a brief moment her smile faltered as she recognized Adrian standing among the guests. But what truly captured her attention was the woman standing beside him. The music faded slightly as the couple began greeting guests near the stage. Natalie continued scanning the room, clearly trying to understand who Sophie was and why Adrian had brought her. Sophie felt Adrian gently take her hand. "Remember, Adrian said quietly, just act natural." Sophie nodded, though the tension in the room was growing stronger with every passing second. Finally, Natalie stepped away from the stage and began walking through the crowd directly toward them. Conversations around the ballroom softened as people noticed her path. Guests sensed that something important was about to happen. Sophie took a slow, steady breath while maintaining her calm expression. Adrian remained composed beside her. Within moments, Natalie Cross stopped only a few feet away from them, her smile returning though her eyes held unmistakable curiosity. "Adrian," she said smoothly, "I am surprised you came tonight." Adrian answered with equal calm. "Congratulations, Natalie. It appears you have quite a celebration planned." Natalie's gaze shifted to Sophie, and her smile grew slightly sharper. "And you must be the reason everyone is whispering." She extended her hand politely. "I do not believe we have met." For a brief moment, the entire space between them felt strangely quiet despite the soft music still flowing through the ballroom. Natalie Cross stood poised and confident, her hand extended towards Sophie Bennett with elegant patience. Sophie understood that dozens of people around them were now watching carefully, pretending to continue their conversations while secretly observing every word that would be spoken. She accepted Natalie's hand and offered a calm, polite smile. "My name is Sophie Bennett. It is nice to meet you." Natalie's handshake was gentle but deliberate, her eyes studying Sophie closely as if searching for hidden clues. A small pause followed before Natalie spoke again. "Sophie Bennett, I do not believe I have heard Adrian mention you before." Adrian answered smoothly before Sophie could respond. "That is because Sophie and I prefer to keep our personal life private." Natalie raised one eyebrow slightly, though her smile remained perfectly composed. "How mysterious." Her gaze moved briefly from Sophie to Adrian and then back again. "I suppose surprises make evenings like this more interesting." Sophie sensed the subtle challenge hidden inside the polite words. Instead of appearing uncomfortable, she responded with calm warmth. "I imagine tonight must be very exciting for you. Congratulations on your engagement." Natalie studied her again for a second longer, perhaps expecting nervousness or uncertainty, but Sophie showed neither. "Thank you," Natalie replied. "Marcus and I are very happy." At that moment, Marcus Reed approached them from behind Natalie. He carried himself with quiet confidence and the relaxed posture of a man who had spent his entire life inside rooms like this. "Adrian," he said with a friendly tone that felt slightly rehearsed, "it is good to see you here tonight." Adrian nodded politely. "Congratulations, Marcus." Marcus glanced towards Sophie with open curiosity. "And this must be the mysterious woman everyone has been asking about." Adrian spoke with steady composure. "Marcus, this is Sophie Bennett." Marcus extended his hand with an easy smile. Sophie shook it politely. "A pleasure to meet you." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Sophie Bennett. That name does not sound familiar from any of our social circles." Sophie answered calmly. "That is probably because I am not part of your social circles." For a split second, Marcus seemed slightly surprised by the honesty of her reply, but then he laughed lightly. "Fair enough. I respect honesty." Natalie watched the interaction carefully, her expression still polished, but her eyes sharper now. Adrian noticed the growing attention from surrounding guests. Several people nearby had clearly paused their conversations so they could listen. Natalie finally spoke again. her voice smooth but carrying a faint edge of curiosity. "So Sophie, how exactly did you and Adrian meet?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Sophie glanced at Adrian briefly before answering. "On a rainy evening in Manhattan. I was playing violin near a subway entrance. Adrian happened to stop and listen." Several nearby guests exchanged curious looks. The story sounded far too unusual for the typical introductions expected in their world. Natalie gave a soft laugh that did not quite reach her eyes. "A violinist on the street. How romantic." Adrian remained calm, but his voice carried quiet firmness when he spoke. "Sophie's music is extraordinary." Natalie studied Sophie again, this time more carefully than before. She clearly had not expected Adrian to speak about anyone with such genuine respect. Marcus glanced between them with interest before lifting a glass from a passing tray. "Well, I believe this evening calls for celebration rather than interrogation." He raised his glass toward Adrian and Sophie. "To unexpected introductions." Sophie lifted her own glass politely and joined the toast. Around them, the tension slowly softened as guests resumed their conversations. Yet Natalie remained thoughtful, her gaze lingering briefly on Sophie, as if she sensed that the quiet violinist standing beside Adrian might become far more memorable than anyone had predicted. Sophie noticed the look but did not react. Instead, she turned slightly toward Adrian and whispered softly, so only he could hear. "That could have gone much worse." Adrian allowed himself a small smile. "The night is still young." Sophie followed his gaze across the ballroom where the orchestra was beginning another elegant melody. In that moment, she realized something important. She had entered this world as a stranger, but somehow she was no longer invisible. The orchestra resumed its elegant melody as conversations slowly returned to normal across the ballroom. Yet the quiet tension surrounding Adrian Cole and Sophie Bennett had not completely disappeared. People continued glancing toward them with subtle curiosity. The mysterious violinist who had arrived beside one of the most powerful investors in New York City had clearly become the most interesting story of the evening. Sophie could feel the attention, but instead of shrinking away from it, she allowed herself to relax slightly. She took a careful sip from her glass and observed the room around her. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished marble floors, while groups of guests laughed softly near tall windows overlooking the city skyline. For the first time since arriving, Sophie allowed herself to enjoy the moment. Adrian leaned closer and spoke quietly. "You handled that conversation better than most people in this room would have." Sophie gave a small, amused smile. "I think people underestimate street musicians. We learn very quickly how to read a crowd." Adrian nodded thoughtfully. "That skill might prove useful tonight." Before Sophie could ask what he meant, the music on stage suddenly faltered. A violinist from the orchestra paused and spoke quietly with the conductor. A low murmur moved through the crowd as the musicians attempted to continue, but the melody stumbled again. Something was clearly wrong. One of the musicians stepped forward to whisper something to the master of ceremonies near the stage. Moments later, the man cleared his throat and addressed the guests with polite calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we are experiencing a small technical difficulty with one of our instruments. Please enjoy your refreshments while we resolve the matter." Sophie noticed the embarrassed expressions on the faces of several musicians. One violin had apparently broken a string, leaving the orchestra without its lead instrument. She watched them for a moment before quietly turning to Adrian. "That is unfortunate timing." Adrian followed her gaze toward the stage. "It happens sometimes during live performances." Sophie hesitated for only a second before speaking again. "If they need a violin, I have one in the car." Adrian looked at her with surprise. "You are serious?" Sophie nodded calmly. "Music is music, whether it is played on a sidewalk or in a ballroom." Adrian considered the idea carefully. Before he could respond, Margaret Ashford suddenly appeared beside them, having arrived earlier to deliver another gown for a different guest. She had been watching the stage with concern. "Sophie," she said softly, "I heard you mention a violin." Sophie nodded. "I always keep it with me." Margaret's eyes brightened with sudden inspiration. "The orchestra needs a violinist right now." Sophie looked toward the stage again, where the musicians were still attempting to repair the instrument. The entire ballroom was waiting in awkward silence. Adrian studied her expression. "Are you comfortable performing in front of this many people?" Sophie smiled gently. "I have performed on crowded streets during rush hour. This cannot be much worse." Adrian allowed a small smile to return. Then perhaps tonight will become even more memorable. Margaret quickly spoke with the conductor near the stage, explaining the situation. Within moments, the conductor approached Sophie with hopeful eyes. "Miss Bennett, would you be willing to assist us for a few minutes while we replace the damaged instrument?" Sophie glanced at Adrian once more. He gave a simple, encouraging nod. With quiet confidence, Sophie handed her empty glass to a passing waiter and followed the conductor toward the stage. The crowd watched with growing curiosity as the elegantly dressed young woman who had arrived beside Adrian Cole stepped beneath the bright lights of the orchestra platform. Sophie lifted the violin that one of the musicians handed her and positioned it beneath her chin with practiced ease. The conductor raised his baton again, and the orchestra prepared to begin. For a moment, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Then Sophie drew the bow gently across the strings, and the first clear note filled the room like a beam of light cutting through silence. Within seconds, the melody rose beautifully above the orchestra, strong and graceful, transforming the earlier embarrassment into something unexpectedly magical. Guests across the ballroom turned toward the stage with astonishment as the mysterious woman who had arrived. As Adrian Cole's date revealed the extraordinary talent that had once echoed beneath a rainy street lamp. The final note of the violin floated through the ballroom like a breath that no one wanted to release. For several seconds after Sophie Bennett finished playing, the entire room remained completely silent. Then the applause began. At first it came from a few tables near the stage, but within moments the entire ballroom erupted into enthusiastic clapping. Guests who only minutes earlier had been whispering about the mysterious woman beside Adrian Cole were now staring at her with genuine admiration. Sophie lowered the violin slowly, surprised by the reaction. She had performed in public many times before, but never in a room filled with wealthy executives, investors, and social elites wearing gowns worth more than some apartments. The conductor smiled warmly and nodded with deep appreciation before gently taking the instrument back from her hands. "Thank you, Miss Bennett. You have saved our evening." Sophie returned the smile modestly and stepped down from the stage. As she walked back across the ballroom, the crowd naturally parted for her. Conversations began again, but now the tone had changed. Instead of curiosity, there was respect. Several guests nodded politely as she passed, clearly impressed by the performance they had just witnessed. Adrian was waiting for her near the edge of the dance floor. His expression held quiet pride when she approached. "I think you just became the most interesting person in this entire room," he said calmly. Sophie laughed softly, still slightly breathless from the performance. "That was not part of our agreement. Remember?" Adrian replied with a hint of amusement. "I believe you have exceeded every expectation." Before Sophie could answer, a young woman holding a phone stepped forward from the nearby crowd. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I recorded part of that performance. Would you mind if I shared it online?" Sophie hesitated for a moment before nodding. "If you think people will enjoy it." Within minutes, several other guests began discussing the video as it quickly spread across social media. Phones lit up across the ballroom as more people watched the brief recording of the elegant violinist who had unexpectedly saved the evening. Whispers began again, but this time the tone was filled with excitement. "Sophie Bennett," someone murmured nearby. "Remember that name." Across the room, Natalie Cross had been watching the entire scene unfold with growing tension hidden beneath her perfect smile. At first she had expected Adrian's mysterious companion to embarrass herself among the wealthy guests. Instead, the opposite had happened. The quiet musician had somehow captured the admiration of nearly everyone present. Marcus Reed stood beside Natalie, observing the crowd's reaction with interest. "It appears your former partner chose his company wisely tonight," Marcus said thoughtfully. Natalie forced a soft laugh, though her eyes remained fixed on Sophie. Temporary attention fades quickly. Marcus did not respond, but he continued watching Sophie with genuine curiosity. Natalie finally stepped forward and moved toward Adrian and Sophie again, her posture graceful but determined. Several nearby guests fell silent as they sensed another confrontation approaching. Natalie stopped beside them with a bright smile that looked flawless from a distance. "Sophie," she said smoothly, "that was quite a performance. You must have practiced for many years." Sophie answered politely. "Music has always been part of my life." Natalie tilted her head slightly. "I imagine playing violin on the street requires confidence." A few guests exchanged glances, recognizing the subtle insult hidden within the compliment. Adrian's expression hardened slightly, but Sophie remained calm. Playing music anywhere requires courage, she replied quietly. Natalie's smile tightened for a brief moment before she spoke again. It is impressive that someone from such a modest background could adapt so quickly to a room like this. Sophie met her gaze without hesitation. Talent does not depend on where someone comes from. The nearby guests listened closely, clearly fascinated by the exchange. Marcus stepped forward gently, sensing the tension building. Perhaps we should allow our guests to enjoy the evening, he suggested. Natalie finally nodded, though her eyes lingered on Sophie for a moment longer. Enjoy the party, she said before turning away. As Natalie walked back toward the stage, Sophie exhaled quietly. Adrian leaned closer and spoke softly. That was another victory. Sophie glanced around the ballroom where guests were still discussing her performance with admiration. I think the night is only getting started, she replied. The music of the orchestra returned to its smooth rhythm, and the celebration inside the Grand Lexington Hotel continued. But something subtle had shifted in the atmosphere of the ballroom. Sophie Bennett was no longer simply the mysterious date of Adrian Cole. She had become the woman everyone wanted to talk about. Groups of guests whispered quietly while glancing in her direction, and several people approached Adrian with curious smiles, clearly eager to meet the violinist who had unexpectedly transformed the evening. Sophie remained calm beside Adrian, though inside she still felt the strange mixture of excitement and disbelief that came from realizing she had stepped into a world she had never imagined entering. Adrian watched the reactions around them carefully. You are officially the most discussed guest tonight, he said quietly. Sophie gave a small, amused smile. I am beginning to understand why people say wealthy parties are more dramatic than television shows. Adrian laughed softly for the first time that evening. That might be the most accurate description I have ever heard. A waiter passed again with a tray of drinks, and Sophie accepted a glass of sparkling water this time. Across the ballroom, Natalie Cross stood near the stage, speaking quietly with two women who appeared to be close friends. Although Natalie maintained her graceful posture, her eyes continued drifting towards Sophie with increasing curiosity. Finally, one of the women leaned closer and whispered something to Natalie while showing her a phone screen. Natalie took the phone and her expression changed slightly as she watched the video that had already begun circulating online. The recording showed Sophie standing on the orchestra stage only minutes earlier, playing the violin with elegance and confidence. Several nearby guests could be seen applauding in the background. Natalie handed the phone back slowly, her smile returning though the tension behind it was impossible to hide completely. It appears your mysterious guest is becoming quite popular, one of the women commented. Natalie answered smoothly. Popularity is often temporary. What matters is background. She glanced once more towards Sophie and Adrian before turning away, clearly thinking carefully. Meanwhile, across the room, Marcus Reed approached Adrian again with relaxed curiosity. That performance was impressive, Marcus said honestly. I was not expecting tonight to include a private concert. Adrian responded calmly. Neither was I. Marcus studied Sophie thoughtfully. You mentioned earlier that you met while she was playing music on the street. That sounds like an unusual beginning. Sophie nodded politely. Life is full of unusual beginnings. Marcus seemed genuinely amused by the answer. I admire confidence. However, not everyone in this room will understand it the same way. Adrian noticed the subtle warning hidden within Marcus's words. I believe Sophie can handle herself, Adrian replied calmly. Marcus raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement before walking away again. For several minutes, the evening continued peacefully. Guests returned to their conversations, and the orchestra resumed its elegant melodies. Sophie began to relax slightly, believing that perhaps the most difficult part of the evening had already passed. But then the master of ceremonies returned to the stage once more. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced warmly, before we continue the celebration, we would like to invite Natalie Cross and Marcus Reed to share a few words with our honored guests. Applause filled the ballroom as Natalie and Marcus stepped onto the stage together. Natalie accepted the microphone with confident grace and began thanking friends, family members, and business partners for attending the celebration. Her voice carried smoothly through the room while guests listened politely. Then halfway through her speech, Natalie paused briefly. Her eyes moved across the crowd until they settled on Sophie Bennett, standing beside Adrian Cole. A quiet smile appeared on her face as she continued speaking. "Tonight has already been filled with wonderful surprises," she said. "For example, we discovered that Adrian brought a very talented musician with him." Guests turned their attention towards Sophie again. Natalie continued with calm elegance. "However, I have always believed that the most interesting stories are the ones we do not know yet." She looked directly at Sophie now. "Miss Bennett, would you mind telling everyone here a little more about yourself?" The room grew noticeably quieter as dozens of curious faces turned toward the young violinist. Sophie felt Adrian's hand gently tighten around hers as the attention of the entire ballroom focused on her. It was clear that Natalie had just placed her at the center of the evening's next unexpected moment. For several seconds, the entire ballroom remained silent after Natalie Cross asked her question. Sophie's name still echoed softly through the room, while dozens of guests turned their attention toward her. The elegant violinist who had saved the evening now stood at the center of every curious gaze in the Grand Lexington Hotel. Sophie felt the weight of the moment immediately. She could sense that this was not simply a polite invitation to speak. It was a test. Natalie was smiling from the stage with graceful confidence, but the intention behind the request was clear. She wanted the mysterious woman beside Adrian Cole to reveal herself. Adrian stood close to Sophie, his expression calm but protective. His hand remained gently around hers as he leaned closer and spoke quietly, so only she could hear. "You do not have to answer if you do not want to." Sophie looked toward the stage again, where Natalie waited patiently beside Marcus Reed. For a brief moment, Sophie considered simply declining the invitation and remaining silent. But then she remembered something important. She had spent years performing on sidewalks where strangers ignored her or judged her without ever knowing who she truly was. Tonight she was no longer invisible. Slowly Sophie released Adrian's hand and stepped forward through the quiet crowd. Each step across the ballroom floor felt surprisingly steady. Guests moved aside instinctively, creating a clear path toward the stage. When Sophie reached the front of the room, she accepted the microphone from the master of ceremonies with a polite nod. The bright stage lights reflected gently across the sapphire necklace resting against her collarbone. Sophie took a calm breath before speaking. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Sophie Bennett." Her voice carried clearly across the ballroom, confident yet warm. A few people nodded politely, while others watched with intense curiosity. Sophie continued speaking without hesitation. "Natalie asked me to share a little about myself, so I will begin with the truth. I am a musician. I play violin wherever people are willing to listen. Sometimes that means performing inside beautiful rooms like this one. Other times it means standing beneath a street lamp near a subway entrance while the rain falls on the pavement." A soft ripple of whispers moved through the guests as they realized she was speaking honestly rather than trying to impress them. Sophie smiled slightly as she continued. "Tonight I happened to meet Adrian Cole while I was playing music in the city. He stopped and listened. That simple moment led to an unexpected conversation and an invitation to attend this celebration. Some people might find that story unusual." Sophie paused briefly and glanced toward Natalie on the stage. But life does not always follow the paths we expect. The ballroom remained silent as guests listened carefully. Sophie continued with calm sincerity. "I understand that many people here come from extraordinary backgrounds filled with opportunity and influence. My background is much simpler. I grew up learning that music is a language that belongs to everyone. Whether someone listens from the front row of a concert hall or from the sidewalk outside a busy street corner, the music itself does not change." Several guests nodded thoughtfully as they listened. Sophie's words carried a quiet honesty that felt refreshing in a room often filled with practiced speeches. Finally, Sophie concluded gently. "Tonight, I was fortunate enough to share a few notes of music with all of you. For that I am grateful." She handed the microphone back to the master of ceremonies and stepped away from the stage. For a brief moment, the room remained quiet again. Then applause began to rise from several tables near the front of the ballroom. Within seconds, the entire crowd joined in. Adrian watched from across the room with a mixture of admiration and surprise. The woman who had been standing beneath a rainy street lamp only hours earlier had just won the respect of an entire ballroom filled with powerful strangers. On the stage, Natalie Cross maintained her elegant smile as she clapped politely with the rest of the guests. Yet behind the perfect expression, there was a new realization forming in her mind. The quiet musician she had tried to expose had just turned the moment into something she could not control. And in doing so, Sophie Bennett had transformed the entire evening. The applause slowly faded across the ballroom of the Grand Lexington Hotel, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that everyone could feel. Conversations resumed, yet the tone was different now. The guests who had arrived expecting a predictable evening of wealth and celebration had just witnessed something far more genuine. Sophie Bennett stepped down from the stage and walked calmly back through the crowd. People moved aside with new respect, some even offering quiet smiles as she passed. Adrian Cole remained where he had been standing near the edge of the dance floor, watching her approach with an expression that was both proud and thoughtful. When Sophie reached him, he spoke softly. That was not part of the plan, but it was the best moment of the entire evening. Sophie gave a small, amused smile. I simply told the truth. Adrian nodded slowly. The truth is surprisingly powerful in rooms like this. For a few minutes the celebration returned to its normal rhythm. The orchestra resumed, playing a gentle melody, while waiters moved through the crowd offering drinks and small plates of food. Yet the quiet shift in attention remained. Several business leaders approached Adrian with friendly curiosity, congratulating him on bringing such an interesting guest. Others approached Sophie directly, asking about her music and complimenting the performance that had saved the orchestra earlier in the evening. Sophie answered politely, though she remained humble in every conversation. Across the ballroom, Natalie Cross stepped down from the stage beside Marcus Reed. Her elegant smile remained in place, but the calm confidence she had shown earlier now carried a hint of frustration that only those watching closely could notice. She had expected the mysterious musician to become an embarrassment for Adrian. Instead, the opposite had happened. Marcus observed the reactions around the room with quiet interest. You underestimated her, he said calmly. Natalie responded in a low voice. I underestimated the situation. Marcus studied Sophie again as she spoke with several guests near the orchestra. She seems comfortable anywhere, he said thoughtfully. Natalie folded her arms slightly. Confidence can appear convincing for a short time. Eventually people remember where someone comes from. Marcus did not argue, but he continued watching the interaction with curiosity. Back near the dance floor, the orchestra began playing a slower melody that signaled the start of the evening dance. Several couples stepped onto the polished floor beneath the glowing chandeliers. Adrian turned towards Sophie and extended his hand politely. Would you care to dance? Sophie looked surprised for a moment before smiling gently. I have never danced in a ballroom like this before. Adrian answered with calm reassurance. Neither have I. That made her laugh quietly. Then perhaps we will both learn something tonight. Sophie placed her hand in his, and together they stepped onto the dance floor. The music flowed smoothly as Adrian guided her with quiet confidence. Despite the elegance of the setting, the dance felt surprisingly natural. Sophie's movements followed the rhythm easily, the same sense of timing that guided her violin now guiding her steps across the floor. Guests watching nearby whispered again, this time with admiration rather than curiosity. The pair looked unexpectedly perfect together beneath the golden lights. While they danced, Sophie spoke softly. I hope this evening helped you the way you hoped it would. Adrian considered her words carefully. When I arrived tonight, I believed I needed to prove something to my past. He paused briefly before continuing. Now I realize something else. Sophie looked at him with curiosity. What is that? Adrian met her gaze with quiet honesty. The best moments of this evening had nothing to do with Natalie or Marcus or any of the people who expected to judge me. They happened because you were here. Sophie did not answer immediately, but the gentle smile that appeared on her face revealed that she understood the meaning behind his words. Across the room, Natalie watched them dance beneath the chandeliers while the applause from earlier still echoed faintly in the memory of the guests. For the first time that evening, she realized something she had not expected. The quiet musician she had tried to expose had not only won the admiration of the crowd. She had also changed the man Natalie once believed she understood completely. The slow melody of the orchestra continued to echo gently through the Grand Lexington Ballroom, as Adrian Cole and Sophie Bennett finished their dance beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. For a brief moment, they remained standing close together while the music faded into the next song. Around them, the celebration carried on with laughter, conversation, and the soft clinking of glasses, yet the two of them seemed to exist in a quieter world inside the crowded room. Sophie looked around the ballroom and then back at Adrian with a thoughtful expression. I think the most difficult part of the evening is finally over. Adrian followed her gaze across the crowd. Natalie Cross and Marcus Reed were speaking with a group of guests near the stage, while photographers captured a few formal pictures of the engaged couple. Adrian spoke calmly. You handled everything tonight better than anyone could have expected. Sophie smiled gently. Including you. Adrian laughed softly. Especially me. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The events of the evening seemed almost unreal when compared to the quiet, rainy street where they had first met only a few hours earlier. Sophie finally broke the silence. Our agreement was for one night. Adrian nodded slowly. Yes, it was. Sophie looked toward the large windows of the ballroom, where the lights of Manhattan glittered against the dark sky. I suppose that means our story ends when this party does. Adrian did not answer immediately. He watched her for a moment, as if carefully considering something he had not expected to feel. When I asked you to come here tonight, I believed I needed someone to stand beside me so that I would not look alone in front of my past. Sophie listened quietly as he continued. But somewhere between the orchestra stage and the dance floor, I realized something surprising. Sophie tilted her head slightly. What did you realize? Adrian spoke with calm honesty. I realized that the person who helped me the most tonight was not someone pretending to be part of my life. It was someone who reminded me that life is larger than pride or regret. Sophie felt the sincerity in his voice, and for a moment, she did not know how to respond. The orchestra began another soft melody as several couples stepped onto the dance floor again. Guests nearby were still discussing the violin performance and the speech Sophie had given earlier. In a single evening, she had become the unexpected highlight of a celebration that was never meant to include her. Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small velvet box. Sophie looked at him with confusion. What is that? Adrian opened the box slowly. Inside rested the same delicate sapphire necklace she had worn all evening. Sophie looked down at the stone resting against her collarbone. You already gave this to me. Adrian shook his head gently. No, I loaned it to you for tonight. Sophie studied his expression carefully. And now, Adrian held the box out toward her again. Now I would like you to keep it. Not as part of an agreement. Not as a payment. Simply as a reminder that this evening was real. Sophie hesitated for a moment. The necklace represented far more than a piece of jewelry. It represented the strange, beautiful series of events that had brought two completely different worlds together for one unexpected night. Are you sure? She asked quietly. Adrian nodded. I am sure. Sophie finally accepted the small velvet box with a gentle smile. Thank you. At that moment, the master of ceremonies announced that the celebration would soon conclude with a final toast for the engaged couple. Guests began gathering near the stage once again. Adrian and Sophie remained near the dance floor watching the scene unfold. Natalie raised her glass beside Marcus while photographers captured the final images of the evening. Yet even as the applause filled the ballroom, Adrian realized that the most meaningful part of the night had already happened. He turned towards Sophie once more. When the party ends, I would like to ask you something. Sophie looked at him with quiet curiosity. What is that? Adrian smiled slightly. I would like to ask if you would consider seeing me again tomorrow. Not as my date for an evening, but as yourself. Sophie's eyes brightened with gentle surprise as the orchestra played its final notes, and the celebration slowly began to draw to a close. The final toast echoed across the ballroom as guests lifted their glasses toward Natalie Cross and Marcus Reed. Applause filled the Grand Lexington Hotel once again, while the orchestra played a gentle, closing melody. Photographers captured the last images of the evening, while the elegant celebration slowly began to fade into quiet conversations and goodbyes. Adrian Cole stood beside Sophie Bennett near the tall windows overlooking the city skyline. Outside, the lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly into the night, reflecting across the river like scattered gold. Sophie watched the scene thoughtfully. Only a few hours earlier, she had been standing beneath a street lamp with her violin case open on a wet sidewalk. Now she stood in one of the most luxurious ballrooms in New York City, wearing a sapphire necklace and listening to the final applause of a celebration she had never expected to attend. Life can change very quickly, she said softly. Adrian nodded beside her. Sometimes it only takes one unexpected moment. Across the room, Natalie finished greeting several guests before turning briefly toward Adrian and Sophie. For a moment, their eyes met from across the ballroom. Natalie offered a polite nod, acknowledging the strange turn the evening had taken. Adrian returned the gesture calmly. The past that had once seemed so important now felt distant and strangely unimportant compared to the present moment standing beside Sophie. Soon the master of ceremonies thanked everyone for attending and guests began making their way toward the exits. Waiters collected empty glasses while the orchestra packed away their instruments. The celebration that had been planned for months was finally ending. Adrian turned towards Sophie again. I meant what I said earlier. I would like to see you again tomorrow. Sophie held the small velvet box containing the sapphire necklace gently in her hands. Her eyes reflected both warmth and curiosity. Tomorrow sounds very soon. Adrian smiled slightly. I spent too much time waiting in the past. I would rather not waste any more time. Sophie studied his expression carefully, searching for the same honesty she had sensed when he first stopped beside her on that rainy street. She found it easily. What would we do tomorrow? She asked. Adrian considered the question for a moment before answering. I know a quiet concert hall in the city that sometimes allows musicians to practice during the morning hours. I thought you might like to play there. Sophie blinked in surprise. Just play music. Adrian nodded. No crowds. No photographers. Just music. Sophie smiled slowly as the idea settled in her mind. That sounds much more comfortable than performing in front of an entire ballroom. Adrian extended his hand toward her again, not with the formal elegance he had used earlier, but with a simple sincerity. Then tomorrow morning we begin again. This time without pretending. Sophie looked at his hand for a moment before placing her own in it. Tomorrow morning, she agreed softly. Together they walked toward the entrance of the Grand Lexington Hotel, where the cool night air waited beyond the glass doors. The red carpet outside was nearly empty now, the photographers already gone, the rain from earlier replaced by a quiet clear sky. Adrian paused on the steps beside Sophie as the city stretched before them with endless possibility. He had arrived at the party hoping to prove something to his past. Instead, he was leaving with something far more valuable. A beginning he had never expected. Sophie looked out across the glowing streets of Manhattan and felt the same quiet realization. The evening that had begun as a simple favor between two strangers had become something entirely different. A fake date had turned into a real connection. And as they stepped into the night together, both of them understood that the most important part of their story was only just beginning.